What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. Today we're going to be going over the two-handed stamina necromancer build. Now just like the previous two-handed build videos, we will be not going over our character sheet nor our gear. That is covered in a separate video which you can find up in the upper right hand corner. Should be popping up right about now here. So if you guys are interested in the specific gear that I'm yarning, then please check out that video there. That'll explain all the different gear options in depth. This video is just taking a look at the skills that we're going to be using, as well as the rotation, along with obviously a 21 million dummy parse. So the two-handed on a necromancer, not quite as strong as dual wield, but it does provide some additional AoE potential, which is the main reason why people run two-handed builds. It's not for the single target damage that it has, it's mostly for the AoE potential. In fact, a lot of endgame guilds, if you're running stamina DPS, will typically run a two-handed build for trash pulls and for boss fights where cleave is more important than raw single target damage. In terms of the single target damage itself, it actually doesn't do that bad compared to a traditional dual wield bow build, but of course it is going to be a little bit weaker in general because you will be giving up some of that single target potential from losing out on the cruel flurry buff, for example. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. Now, in terms of skills, one of the things that was a little bit tricky to balance out with a two-handed stamina necromancer build is the fact that we do need to keep track of the death knell passive. So ideally, we want to have at least 40%. 30% is okay, but 40% will guarantee us a 100% crit rating when we're in execute. So right now we're at 47.9%, and this is without minor savagery and major savagery. Once we have those two buffs active, we should get another 16% weapon damage, weapon crit, I should say. So that does bump us up to around 60% or so. So we want to get at least 40% from our death knell passive in order to get up to 100% crit chance. That would basically mean that every hit under 25% health will always be a crit. So we need to fit in at least 4 abilities on our bar here. So we have Detonating Siphon, Venom Skull, Blighted Blastbones, and Pestilent Colossus. Other two abilities on our front bar are from the two-handed line itself, so Carve for the bleed, and then Executioner for our execute. Then on our back bar, pretty much looks exactly the same as a typical bow bar for a stamina necromancer. So we have Consuming Trap, Poison Injection, Arrow Barrage, Skeletal Archer, Barbed Trap, and Pestilent Colossus. Again, this is just to maintain that additional death knell passive. So he gets 20% on our back bar rather than 40%, but it's still going to be very useful here. So in terms of which abilities you want to swap out, Detonating Siphon is probably going to be the best ability that you're going to want to swap out here. So this will probably be swapped out for a self-heal in those instances where you need a self-heal. There are some other options though if you do want to swap abilities out. For example, Skeletal Archer might be a good ability to swap out as well. So kind of depends on how you want to deal with certain abilities. So you can certainly keep, for example, Detonating Siphon and Skeletal Archer, but you can also swap these two abilities out here. One of the big downsides of running a Necromancer is the fact that you don't have very good sustain. Even with the changes to using Soul Trap, your sustain is still pretty bad. And as you'll see with this particular 21 million parse, even with parse food, we can just barely manage to sustain a full 21 million dummy parse. It is quite difficult to fully sustain the rotation, so it might be worthwhile to swap one of these abilities out for an ability that will help out your overall sustain. So, for example, you might want to run Avid Boneyard on Unnerving Boneyard. One, this costs Magicka, and the other thing too is that if you're running Lokkestiiz, running Avid Boneyard will give you an additional synergy, so you'll be able to get better uptime on Lokkestiiz. Unnerving Boneyard is also pretty good for the AoE Major Breach and Major Fracture though. Plus, it also gives out the synergy still to your allies, so it could help your tank's Alkosh uptime. From there, you also have Mortal Coil, which is not terrible as a sustain move, but definitely not the best. So I probably wouldn't recommend running Mortal Coil here. It is a fairly decent heal, actually. So if you want to run this as a healing ability, you certainly can. But even then, in my opinion, Vigor is a better option rather than Mortal Coil. But it is one potential option here for sustain. The main drawback of running Mortal Coil for sustain is the fact that you do need a corpse to target in order to use Mortal Coil. So if you're replacing Detonating Siphon with Mortal Coil, then you would work out because you need a corpse to activate Detonating Siphon already. But really, not really an ability I would recommend here. Under the two-handed line, I do want to point out and kind of explain why we're not using Wrecking Blow or Stampede. So if we take a look at Wrecking Blow here, it does do a decent amount of damage, but it does have a cast time associated with it. So you're not going to be able to get quite as many out as you would with an instant to cast ability like Venom Skull. While Venom Skull doesn't deal as much damage, one of the advantages of running Venom Skull here is the fact that it contributes to the Death Knell passive, which is very important for Execute. In addition, the third cast deals additional 20% damage, which isn't that much, but it still ends up being something. So Venom Skull is going to be, generally speaking, a little bit better than Wrecking Blow, and obviously Executioner just gets stronger once we get below 50% health, so this is obviously better than Wrecking Blow after a certain point. We're also not running Stampede, even though it does deal a AoE dot, mainly because we just don't have space. You could run this instead of Carve if you'd like. It's not a bad option, but it's definitely weaker than Carve here, so I wouldn't usually recommend running Stampede here. Now in terms of Carve, you can go with the other Morph Brawler if you prefer the additional survivability. You will be losing out on the bleed from Carve, however, Brawler does give you that damage shield, which is actually pretty nice in certain scenarios, so if you need additional survivability, Brawler is definitely a decent option here, but you will be giving up a little bit of DPS in order to get that survivability. In terms of Executioner, you can go with the other Morph Reverse Slice instead. Reverse Slice, you're going to be giving up some single target damage because the additional execute damage is not quite as high, 300% compared to 400%, but you do gain a very handy splash component behind Reverse Slice here. So you can see here other enemies nearby take 78% of the damage inflicted to primary target, and this is within 5 meters. So if you're targeting the lowest health enemy, you actually are doing quite a bit of splash damage. So for trash fights, Reverse Slice is incredibly strong. In fact, a lot of endgame PvEers will usually use Reverse Slice rather than Executioner for that additional splash, because if you're running a two-handed build, chances are you're more concerned about the cleave than you are with the actual single target potential. In terms of other abilities you might want to have on hand, if you need major evasion, you can always run Elude or Shuffle. Shuffle will give you the immunity to snares and mobilizations, which is pretty handy. Elude will give you the major expedition, and also lasts for quite a bit longer. It's 40 seconds compared to 20 seconds here on Shuffle. The major evasion definitely helps with your overall survivability. A lot of moves are reduced by major evasion. Under the fighter skilled line, Ring of Preservation is not a bad choice here if you need the additional self-heal. It heals every half second for 618, so it ends up being a 1.2k tick every second, plus you gain the minor protection, which reduces the damage taken. As a DPS, you don't have that many sources of resistances, so this is actually a pretty strong damage resistance move here. Pretty nice, very useful in certain scenarios, but not in all scenarios. The heal itself is actually not that strong compared to something like Vigor, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. You should potentially get Shadow Silk as well for the Black Widow synergy if you ever have bow builds in your group. Not quite as strong as it used to be a few patches ago, but still definitely a move you want to have on hand. It's basically still free damage, so definitely something to have in your arsenal here. Then the best stamina self-heal in the game is going to be Echoing Vigor. You can also go with Resolving Vigor too, but Echoing Vigor does stack on each other, so if you have multiple stamina DPS, each running Echoing Vigor, you will get multiple ticks of Vigor heal going, which ends up being a lot stronger. So here, you will get 2.4k healing every 2 seconds with Echoing Vigor, and it's pretty much the exact same amount with Resolving Vigor, just over a shorter period of time. So basically, Resolving Vigor gives you more burst heal versus Echoing Vigor, which kind of spaces out that heal a little bit more, but you can stack it, so it actually ends up being a little bit stronger if you have a lot of stamina DPS running it. So most people will prefer using Echoing Vigor over Resolving Vigor, though Resolving Vigor is still a potential option to run here. Now, with all that in our skills up, let's go ahead and talk about the rotation. Rotation is static for the most part. You will be using Venom Skull as your spammable until you get to around 35% in health remaining, at which point you will swap over to Executioner instead. At that point, Executioner does a little bit more damage than Venom Skull, so we will be using that move instead. And that is including with the 20% initial damage done on every third cast of Venom Skull here. But like I said, the rotation is fairly static, very simple. And we can do 2 casts of this. There we go. The Detonating Siphon didn't go off the first time. You can see here we have time for 2 Venom Skull casts. Then we do Detonating Siphon, and just go back to our back bar, and we're rotating between Trap and our Archer. Carve, then Bash for Maarselok. And that's the entire rotation there. Again, static, and then once we hit around 35k health remaining, we swap from Venom Skull to 2 Cats of Executioner. So the back bar is always going to be swapping off between Rearm Barbed Trap and Skeletal Archer, depending on which one you is up. The beginning of the parse is a little bit weird because you do need to double cast Barbed Trap to create this artificial gap here. And then the front bar is fairly straightforward, but I will redo it just so you guys know and can see what's going on. So you always start off with Carve first, then Blastbones, and 2 spambles, Detonating Siphon, and then go to your back bar and do your back bar rotation. And then when you go back to your front bar here, it's Carve, Bash, Blastbones, and then you do Executioner twice, and Detonating Siphon again. You do note that with this particular rotation, you will never be, you will be overcasting Detonating Siphon, so you will not get the explosion. But that's the way that it works out. It's usually going to be very difficult to get the explosion happening because you will end up losing out on dot uptime on your back bar, and your back bar dots are much stronger than the Detonating Siphon, the actual explosion that you get out of Detonating Siphon. So that's why I'm okay with overcasting Detonating Siphon, because there's really no good way to do that outside of doing a dynamic rotation, which is overall not something that I would necessarily recommend. So, now that we have all that done, let's go ahead and do a tournament in the parse here. Now, I mentioned this in the beginning here, but Stamina Necromancers still have one of the worst sustains in the game for any stamina class. So we are running Parse Food, which does give us quite a bit of additional sustain here. And you will find that even with the additional sustain from Parse Food, we're going to be struggling towards the end. But I'll let the Parse speak for itself. Right now, let's go ahead and get started here. One thing I do want to point out is that with Pestilent Colossus, just use it whenever it comes up. You have it on both bars, doesn't really matter where you use it. Just be mindful of when you use it, you will basically need to take off 1 spammable from your front bar rotation, whether that's Venom Skull or Executioner. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started here. So you do need to double cast Barbed Trap here just to create that artificial gap. So if you are running Lokkestiiz on the front bar, just remember you gotta use the energies while you're on your front bar, otherwise you will not get that Major Slayer bonus. See here, even with this rotation, we are getting some downtime on our back bar dots, hence why I didn't think it was worth letting Detonating Siphon run its full duration here. A little bit late on that Colossus cast there. You can see just how badly we're sustaining here. Alright, so at this point here we're hitting very close to about 30, oh, we hit 35% health. So instead of Venom Skull now, we're going to be using Executioner, which should help out our sustain a little bit here. But it's still going to be pretty difficult to sustain here, so we might need to do a heavy attack actually. Yeah, we're going to need to do a heavy attack here. So if you need a heavy attack, just take out one spam bull. That's because the heavy attack for your dual wield. Oh, unfortunately, that was on a back bar, so we'll have a little bit less Major Slayer uptime. But again, the heavy attack just takes the place of one spam bull if you find you need to use it. And we'll just finish off with, there we go. So that is it for the rotation itself. So let's go ahead and take a look at how much DPS we were able to pull here. Hopefully, okay. So we pulled 96.1k. To give you a kind of idea of how much of a DPS loss that is, for my build personally, for my parse I should say personally, dual wield parse, it's about 4k difference. So about a 5% difference or so. Noticeable, but not overall that much of a difference in single target DPS. You'll notice here that I also did mess up on one of my Major Slayer procs, so my Major Slayer uptime is a little bit less, so this could have been a little bit higher here. And in terms of Deathbolt versus Executioner, you can see here that Executioner, by the time we're using it, it's pretty much going to be very good chances that we're getting pretty much 100% crit. So you can see here, all of our Executioner hits were crits, which is why our average is so high here compared to Deathbolt here. So don't let the average versus max kind of fool you, because Executioner does have, because it deals more damage by the time we start using it, higher crits here, especially when we're using an Execute when we have 100% crit chance here. All of them are crits here, so pretty strong parse here. Again, 96.1k, pretty decent for a two-handed build. Still going to be one of the strongest classes for in terms of two-handed builds if we're all using two-handed builds here. But yeah, that is going to be it for this build. If you guys have any questions about this build, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.